The rhythmic, clinical beep 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 of the heart monitor in room 314 did not just measure the remaining seconds of Evelyn Vance's life. It measured the silence of a decade. Outside the third-floor window of St. Jude's Palliative Care Wing, a relentless, gray autumn rain washed over the city. It was the kind of rain that blurred the edges of the world, turning the distant skyscrapers into ghostly monoliths and the streetlights into bleeding halos of amber. Inside, the room was cast in a heavy twilight, illuminated only by the sterile green glow of the medical equipment and the faint, cold light creeping through the blinds. Evelyn lay perfectly still beneath the faded floral hospital blanket. Though her mind was a tempest, at 73, cancer had systematically dismantled her body, stealing her weight, her stamina, and the vibrant color that used to define her cheeks. Her silver hair was fanned out across the pillow like spilt silk. A clear plastic nasal cannula delivered a steady, hissing stream of oxygen, a futile attempt to ease the labor of lungs that were rapidly filling with fluid. But it wasn't the physical pain that made her chest tighten until she gasped. It was the weight of an unfulfilled life. Standing near the foot of the bed was Dr. Harris, a seasoned oncologist whose career had been defined by delivering bad news with grace. He looked down at his tablet, his thumb hovering over Evelyn's latest vitals. The numbers were cascading downward in a slow, irreversible trend. Her heart rate was hovering at a fragile 72 beats per minute, a superficial stability that masked a deeper, systemic failure. "Are you comfortable, Evelyn?" Dr. Harris asked softly, his voice dropping into that gentle, modulated register reserved for patients who had crossed the threshold from treatment to transition. Evelyn turned her head slowly, the friction of her skull against the pillow sounding like dry leaves. Her eyes, once a piercing, intelligent blue, were cloudy and wet with unshed tears. She didn't answer his question. Comfort was an illusion. "How long, David?" she whispered. Her voice was thin, a raspy thread of its former self, scraping against her throat. Dr. Harris closed his tablet and stepped closer, placing a warm, steady hand over her blanketed ankles. People he had known Evelyn for 3 years, through the hopeful initial surgeries, the brutal rounds of chemotherapy, and finally, the quiet acceptance of hospice. He owed her the truth. "The next 24 hours are critical, Evelyn. Your body is resting now. I think it's time to say what needs to be said." A bitter smile touched the corner of Evelyn's cracked lips. What needs to be said? If only human hearts were as logical as medical charts. For 10 years, the most important words in her life had been locked behind a wall of pride, stubbornness, and geographical distance. With an immense, agonizing effort that drained what little energy she had left, Evelyn lifted her right arm. The skin was translucent, mapping a web of dark blue veins and purple bruises from a dozen forelines. Her hand hovered in the empty, dimly lit space above her chest, her fingers trembling violently as they curled inward, reaching for something or someone who wasn't there. "Sarah," she breathed, a single tear breaking free from the corner of her eye and cutting a wet path down her wrinkled temple. "My sweet Sarah." Dr. Harris sighed quietly, his chest sinking. He knew the name well. It was written in the emergency contact section of Evelyn's file, untouched and uncalled for, a decade, accompanied by an old area code from across the country. The nurses called the number again this morning. "Evelyn," Dr. Harris said gently, leaning over the bed rail. "We left a message with her employer. We told them it was urgent. We are doing everything we can." Evelyn's arm lost its battle with gravity and dropped back onto the mattress. With a soft thud, she closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, the memories came rushing back, unbidden and overwhelming, filling the silent spaces of room 314 with the ghosts of a beautiful, broken past. To understand the silence of room 314, one had to understand the house on Willow Creek Lane, where the walls had once vibrated with music, laughter, and the sharp clinking sounds of a mother and daughter building a life together. Evelyn had been a woman of formidable structure, an architectural draftsman by trade. She viewed the world through the lens of precision, symmetry, and endurance. when her husband, Thomas, died suddenly of a heart attack when Sarah was just 7 years old. Evelyn did not break. Instead, she reinforced her foundations. She poured every ounce of her grief into raising Sarah, determined to build a daughter who was invulnerable to the unpredictability of life. But Sarah was not made of stone or steel. She was made of watercolor and wind. Where Evelyn saw blueprints, Sarah saw canvas. By the time Sarah was 18, her bedroom was a chaotic gallery of oil paintings, charcoal sketches, and poetry scribbled onto the backs of receipts. They loved each other fiercely, but their love was a friction fire. Evelyn pushed for business degrees, stability, and corporate safety. Sarah chased gallery openings, bohemian apartments, and the volatile pursuit of raw expression. The structural failure of their relationship occurred on a hot, suffocating July evening 10 years ago. Sarah, then 22, had stood in the kitchen of the Willow Creek house, her eyes blazing with a mixture of defiance and terror. She had been accepted into a prestigious, unfunded residency program for artists in Paris. It was a dream, but it required sacrificing her final semester of college and taking on a mountain of high-interest debt. It's a whim, Sarah. A romantic fantasy that will leave you bankrupt and stranded, Evelyn had shouted, her voice echoing off the hardwood floors she had worked 2 jobs to pay for. Life isn't a canvas you can just scrape clean when you make a mistake. You need a foundation. Your foundation is a prison, Mom. Sarah had screamed back, her face flushed, tears smudging the charcoal dust on her fingers. You've spent your whole life hiding behind blueprints because you're terrified of anything you can't measure with a ruler. I am suffocating here. You don't want me to succeed. You just want to control me so you never have to feel anxious again. The words had cut deep, slicing through Evelyn's protective armor and striking the raw, wounded core of her widowhood. In her anger and hurt, Evelyn had delivered the ultimatum that would seal their fate. If you walk out that door, Sarah, if you throw away your education and everything I have sacrificed to give you for a pipe dream, do not look back to me for help. You will be entirely on your own. Sarah had looked at her mother looked at her with a cold, profound disappointment that froze Evelyn's blood. I've been on my own for a long time, Mom. She had packed 2 suitcases that night. The front door had clicked shut at 3:14 a.m. Evelyn remembered looking at the digital clock on the microwave, the green numbers burning into her retina. 3:14. The very same numbers that now designated her dying room. In the weeks that followed, pride became a thick, toxic sediment that settled between them. Evelyn waited for the apologetic phone call from Europe, convinced that reality would break her daughter's resolve. Sarah, surviving on stale baguettes and waitressing tips, waited for her mother to validate her art, to call and say she was proud. Neither called. Months bled into years. Years turned into a decade. The silence grew its own roots, deep and immovable, until the rift became an accepted topography of their lives. Evelyn learned of Sarah's return to the States via a mutual acquaintance, discovering that her daughter had settled in Chicago, working as an illustrator. Evelyn had held the phone, her heart pounding, wanting to ask for the address, but the old demon of pride whispered that it wasn't her place to beg. Then came the diagnosis. When the doctor first showed Evelyn the dark, irregular shadow on her CT scan, her first thought wasn't fear of pain or death. It was a sudden, terrifying realization that she had built a beautiful, structurally sound life, but she had locked her only child outside of it. The afternoon light in the hospital room began to die, replaced by the deep indigo of evening. The rain outside had settled into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the glass, a background drone that seemed to slow the passage of time. Nurse Elena entered room 314 quietly, holding a fresh bag of intravenous fluids. She was a young woman with kind, tired eyes and a soft touch. She checked the drip rate, adjusted the blanket around Evelyn's shoulders, and then gently wiped a stray tear from the elderly woman's cheek with a piece of gauze. "She come, Evelyn," Elena said softly, though her voice lacked conviction. "In hospice care, you saw both miracles and tragedies. You saw families reunite at the final hour, and you saw people die with their phones ringing unanswered into the night. Evelyn opened her eyes slightly. The green monitor showed her heart rate fluctuating 74, then 71, then a brief, erratic spike to 78 before settling back down. Her body was a house whose beams were cracking under a heavy snow. I can smell the rain," Evelyn whispered, her mind drifting between the clinical reality of the hospital and the memories of her childhood home in Ohio, where her mother used to bake cinnamon bread on rainy afternoons. "It's pouring outside," Alina replied, trying to keep her grounded. "A real autumn storm." "Sarah hates the thunder," Evelyn muttered, her consciousness fracturing. "When she was small, she would climb into my bed. She would bring her sketchbook. She said if she drew the lightning, it couldn't hurt her because it was trapped on the paper." Alina smiled sadly, writing a note in the chart. "She sounds like a creative soul." "She is. She was. I was too hard on her, Alina," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a desperate, hurried register as if she were running out of breath to say the words. "I thought if I made her strong, the world couldn't hurt her the way it hurt me when Thomas died. But I didn't make her strong. I just made her lonely. Don't do this to yourself, Evelyn. You loved her the best way you knew how." "No," Evelyn said, a sudden spark of her old, fierce clarity returning to her eyes. "I loved my own safety more than her freedom. That isn't love, that's fear." The admission seemed to drain the last remaining reserve of oxygen from her blood. The monitor emitted a sharp, brief alarm as her oxygen saturation dipped. Elena quickly adjusted the flow meter on the wall, increasing the oxygen delivery. The machine quieted down, but the warning had been clear. Evelyn's body was reaching its structural limits. Meanwhile, 70 miles away on an interstate choked with evening traffic and blinded by the torrential downpour, a dilapidated sedan was tearing through the storm. Sarah Vance gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white against the worn leather. Her face was pale, her hair damp from the dash she had made from her studio apartment to the car after receiving the voicemail from St. Jude's. The voice on the machine had been polite but stark. "Your mother's condition has deteriorated significantly. We advise you to come immediately." For 10 years, Sarah had imagined this day. She had rehearsed it in her mind during late nights in her studio, surrounded by her paintings that had finally begun to sell. Paintings that were heavily influenced by the sharp architectural lines her mother had loved, though she would never admit it. She had thought she would feel angry or indifferent or guarded. Instead, she felt an overwhelming, paralyzing terror. "Please, just hold on," Sarah whispered to the dark windshield, the wipers sweeping back and forth in a frantic, useless rhythm against the sheets of water. "Please, Mom, don't leave before I can tell you." The radio in her car was static, broken by occasional weather reports warning of flash floods along the highway. Every red light felt like a personal insult, every braking semi-truck a barrier designed to keep her trapped in her past. The anger that had sustained her for a decade, the righteous indignation of the misunderstood artist had evaporated the moment she heard the word hospice. All that was left was a frightened child who wanted her mother. She remembered the last thing she had said to her mother. "I've been on my own for a long time." It had been a lie, a cruel, defensive lie. She had never been on her own. Her mother's presence had been the invisible gravity around which her entire life revolved. Every painting she created was an unspoken dialogue with Evelyn, an attempt to say, "Look at what I made. Look at who I am. Am I enough now?" Sarah pressed her foot harder onto the accelerator, the engine whining as the car splashed through a deep puddle, throwing a blinding sheet of white water over the hood. By 9 p.m., the atmosphere in room 314 had grown heavy with the unmistakable aroma of approaching death, a stillness that felt almost sacred, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Dr. Harris returned, checking Evelyn's pupillary response and listening to her chest with his stethoscope. The sound was wet, a rattling gurgle known clinically as the terminal respiratory secretion, but known to families as the death rattle. It was the sound of the tide coming in. "Her blood pressure is dropping," Dr. Harris whispered to Alina, who stood by the window. Her kidneys are shutting down. She's entering the final phase. Evelyn was no longer fully conscious of her. The white walls of the hospital had dissolved into a vast, luminous gray landscape. She was walking through the unfinished rooms of the houses she had designed throughout her life. The blueprints were floating through the air like autumn leaves, their clean white lines glowing against the dark. In the center of this dreamscape stood Sarah as a young child, holding up a drawing of a lopsided house with a giant, smiling sun over the roof. "Look, Mommy, I drew a house for us. It has no doors, so anyone can come in, and the windows are made of candy," the little girl said, her laughter ringing like silver bells. In the dream, Evelyn looked down at her own hands, which were holding a red pen, ready to correct the perspective, to draw the straight lines of reality over the child's imagination. But this time, Evelyn dropped the pen. She fell to her knees and wrapped her arms around, burying her face in her hair, which smelled of crayons and rain. "It's beautiful, Sarah," Evelyn sobbed in the dream. "It's the most beautiful house I've ever seen." In the physical reality of room 314, Evelyn's physical body reacted to the internal vision. Her mouth opened slightly, and a soft, trembling sigh escaped her lips. Her right hand, lying limp on the sheet, began to twitch, her fingers curling upward again, reaching into the empty air, searching for the child she had lost in her own rigidity. "She's fighting it," Alina murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "She's resisting the transition. She's waiting." "The human spirit can be incredibly stubborn," Dr. Harris said, looking at the heart monitor. The digital display showed 72. It had been stuck on that number for hours. A fragile, stubborn plateau. It was as if Evelyn's heart had made a covenant with her soul. "I will give you 72 beats every minute until she arrives. Not one more, not one less." The minutes ticked by on the circular wall clock. Las 9:15, las 9:30, 9:45. The storm outside reached its crescendo. A crack of thunder rattled the thick glass of the window, a sharp, violent sound that seemed to pierce through Evelyn's comatose state. Her eyelids fluttered, showing a sliver of cloudy blue. Her breathing became erratic, a series of short, shallow gasps followed by long, terrifying pauses where the heart monitor would emit a low, warning whine before her lungs remembered to move again. "Come on, Sarah," Alina whispered, looking toward the door. "Please, wherever you are, hurry." At 10:12 p.m., the heavy fire doors at the end of the palliative care corridor slammed open with a loud, echoey crash. The sound of frantic, squeaking sneakers against the polished linoleum floor shattered the reverent silence of the wing. Sarah Vance came flying around the corner, her clothes soaked through, her coat trailing water behind her like a broken wing. Her face was smeared with mascara and sweat, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. A nurse at the central station stood up to stop her, but Sarah didn't look at her. She didn't need to look at the room numbers. She could feel the pull of room 314 like a magnetic force. She reached the doorway and froze. The scene before her was exactly what she had feared, yet its reality was a physical blow that stole the remaining air from her lungs. There was her mother, the terrifying, immovable, powerful Evelyn Vance, reduced to a small, frail shadow beneath a hospital blanket. The green light of the machines cast an unearthly glow over her pale features, making her look like a marble statue that had been left out in the rain for too long. Dr. Harris and Alina turned toward the door, recognizing the structural resemblance between the two women, the high cheekbones, the stubborn set of the jaw. Dr. Harris gave Alina a small, knowing nod. They stepped away from the bedside, creating a space for the storm that had just entered the room. "Mom." Sarah's voice was a broken sob, a sound of raw, unadulterated grief that had been bottled up for 3,650 days. She crossed the room in 3 long steps, her wet coat slipping from her shoulders and falling to the floor unheeded. She dropped to her knees beside the bed rail, her hands shaking as she reached out and grabbed her mother's outstretched, trembling hand. The contact was electric. The moment Sarah's warm, rain-drenched fingers locked into Evelyn's cold, frail hand, a profound transformation occurred in the room. The erratic, jagged lines on the heart monitor suddenly stabilized. The warning alarms quieted. "Mom, I'm here. It's me, it's Sarah," she cried, pressing Evelyn's bruised hand against her wet cheek, coating her mother's skin with her own hot tears. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry I stayed away. I was so angry, and I was so stupid, and I thought I had time. I thought we had time." Hearing the voice that had haunted her dreams for a decade, the thick, narcotic fog of death in Evelyn's brain parted. It was a miracle of sheer willpower, a final, triumphant surge of the architectural strength that had defined her life. Evelyn's eyes snapped open. They were no longer cloudy for one beautiful, fleeting second. They were the bright, piercing blue of a summer sky. She turned her head on the pillow, her gaze locking onto Sarah's face with absolute recognition. She saw the lines of maturity on her daughter's face. She saw the artist's ink stained into the cuticles of her fingers. She saw the woman she had broken her own heart to raise. Evelyn couldn't speak. The fluid in her lungs made words impossible, but she didn't need them. She had spent her life relying on structures and blueprints to communicate. But in this final, sacred space, she used the oldest language known to humanity. With every ounce of remaining strength in her dying body, Evelyn squeezed Sarah's hand. It wasn't the weak, accidental twitch of a failing reflex. It was a firm, deliberate, and powerful embrace of the fingers. It was a squeeze that carried the weight of 10 years of unsaid words. It said, "I see you. I am proud of you. I forgive you. Please, forgive me." Sarah felt the pressure of her mother's grip, and a fresh wave of tears broke over her face. She leaned her forehead against the edge of the mattress, her shoulders shaking. "I know, Mom. I know. I love you too." A serene, radiant smile appeared on Evelyn's face. The tension that had carved deep lines into her forehead for years vanished, leaving her features smooth and peaceful, almost youthful in the green light of the monitor. The fear of an unfinished heart was gone. The foundation was secure. The digital display on the monitor began to change. The number 72, which had stood like a sentinel through the long hours of the night, began to drop. 70, 65, 50, 35. The jagged green waves on the screen flattened out into a single, smooth, horizontal line. A continuous, peaceful, tone-filled room. 314. A long, beautiful note that signified the end of the storm. Evelyn's head relaxed back onto the center of the pillow. Her eyes remained open, but they were fixed on something far beyond the ceiling of the hospital room, reflecting a light that no one else could see. Dr. Harris stepped forward, gently placing his fingers against Evelyn's carotid artery. After a long moment, he looked down at his watch, then up at Sarah, who was still holding her mother's hand, her face buried in the blanket. "Time of death, 10:14 p.m., Dr. Harris said softly. He didn't turn off the monitor immediately. He allowed the peaceful tone to fill the silence for a few moments more, a sonic testament to a race well run, a structure completed, a last wish fulfilled. 3 days later, the rain had finally stopped, replaced by a crisp, brilliant autumn afternoon that smelled of fallen leaves and clean earth. Sarah stood alone in the empty house on Willow Creek Lane. The furniture was covered in white sheets, looking like silent monuments in the afternoon sun that streamed through the clean windows. Evelyn's estate had passed entirely to her. There had been no second thoughts, no vindictive legal clauses. Even in her silence, Evelyn had protected her child's future. Sarah walked up the stairs to her old bedroom. The room was exactly as she had left it 10 years ago. Her old sketches were still pinned to the corkboard, the edges yellowed with age. But as she turned to leave, she noticed a large, heavy portfolio case sitting on her mother's old mahogany desk in the hallway. It was an archival case, the kind used to store professional blueprints. Attached to the handle was a small, white tag with her name, written in her mother's elegant, precise draftsman's script, for Sarah. With trembling fingers, Sarah unbuckled the leather straps and opened the case. Inside were not blueprints for houses or office buildings. Inside were dozens of sheets of high-quality watercolor paper. Sarah lifted the first sheet and gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a drawing of Sarah at age 14, sitting by the kitchen window, her face illuminated by the morning light, her hair falling over her eyes as she sketched. The drawing was done with a combination of architectural precision and deep, emotional softness. The lines were clean, but the shading was full of love. On the back of the drawing, Evelyn had written a note, dated 5 years after their separation. Dear Sarah, I spent my life drawing lines to keep the world out because I was terrified of losing anything else. But when I look at your art, I realize that lines aren't meant to be walls. They are meant to be bridges. I was never angry that you chose the canvas, my sweet girl. I was just terrified that I wouldn't know how to follow you there. You were always my most beautiful creation. With all my love, Mom. Sarah held the paper against her chest, sitting down on the dusty floor of the hallway as the warm, golden sunlight washed over her. The grief was still there, a sharp, heavy ache in her heart. But the emptiness was gone. The silence between them had been broken, not by words, but by a final touch in a dark room, and the beautiful, enduring architecture of a mother's hidden love. The end, the end. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing tales.